So how does the two-level game work? That's going to be an important thing to figure out. And Lutz et al. Have put a model out there, which is one way of thinking about how this interaction between international organizations and national education systems might work. And the way that they set it out is that there's an independent variable, a dependent variable, and then there's an intervening variable that sort of is in between there. And let me just walk through it a little bit the way that they walk through it. I'm stealing, obviously, their figures directly from the publication from 2008. So you can look at their discussion of that directly in the document if you find a copy, which, like I've said, you can easily find online. So what is an international organization governance instrument? Right? What are the independent variables that then act on the governance and decision making at the national education system level? Well, those instruments range from soft mechanisms like discursive dissemination of new education goals to technical and financial support, which are comparatively harder forms of compulsory regulations. And they've actually got a description of some of the different governance instruments that they document international organizations using. From, again, this discursive dissemination, which would be, the function would be to establish ideas, to control the discourse, right, to control that. And the examples they give would be the UN promotion of sustainable development or the OECD's promotion of lifelong learning. They have, let me get my pointer back up here. Oops. They also have this idea of standard setting, which is the agenda setting, right? Prescribing behavior. So examples from the same organizations would be UN recommendations and OECD benchmarks. There can be more sort of financially coercive means or persuasive means, shall we say, if we wanted to be gentle about it. That would involve transfer payments from the World Bank or from the EU or some other organization. There can be coordinative activities where they basically evaluate or they execute surveillance. So peer reviewing, open method of coordination, all these sorts of ways of maintaining accountability, right? Because you've already got the standards here, so you might as well have the accountability here, would be the cynical way of saying it. And then technical assistance, so some sort of support structure that include, for example, UNESCO's education statistics or planning support. So there are all different ways that these international organizations can actually influence governance or educational decision making at the national level. They establish the discourse, right? They set the discourse, they set the agenda. They are, I mean, if we just want to go all the way over to the left, we could say that they're bribing or they're coercing through financial transfers, that they are in charge of accountability systems or evaluation systems, and so that is a way of agenda setting, and that is a way of establishing what the discourse is. Or they do it through maybe a more technical but a soft way with support structures. So if you, again, educational statistics and planning is controlling the information that's available. It's controlling the discourse. It's controlling the evaluation or the accountability measures. Right? So all of these are pretty high level or pretty impactful governance instruments. If we move on then and we talk about the intervening variable, which would be national transformation capacities, this is, according to Leuze and Company, the degree to which nation states will respond to these international stimuli. And it's mediated by what they call national transformation capacities, which is most prominently played out as veto players and nationally rooted ideas of education. So when we talk about national transformation capacities, veto players, it's the power to say no. It's the power to say, well, that's a huge chunk of money, thank you very much, but we technically don't need it in order to operate, and so we're going to pass, thank you very much. Or it's saying, well, that is an interesting way to establish a mass education system. Yet, our more traditional or nationally rooted ideas of education have more to do with relationships and transfer through working relationships, more like an apprenticeship model. So thank you, but we're going to go with something that's more contextualized in our nation state. Or thank you, but that isn't going to work for us. Now, who are the players? Who's able to say no? Is it an individual? Is it an organization? Is it the nation state or the governing body itself? Well, it could be all three of those or more, right? There could be individuals that have enough power, or they have enough influence, or they are positioned in a way that allows them to veto decisions or governance instruments and governance involvement of international organizations that other people might not be able to. These could be ministers of education, or they could be key community members. For example, if you were in a more religiously affiliated community and the imam said, no, that's not going to work for our girls, or our, we don't want our children exposed to that kind of information, then they could veto whatever it is that the international organization was doing, and it would have a lot of legitimacy in that community, which it wouldn't in another, maybe. It could be organizations. It could be organizations that are built around disciplines or subject areas or have some sort of expertise in education that might offset or might contradict the international organization's agenda, whatever that agenda is, et cetera, et cetera. And then the nationally rooted ideas of education is basically to say, just because an international organization has all of this available to it, it can set the agenda, it can set the discourse, it can pay money out, it can evaluate, it can provide technical assistance. Just because an international organization has all that doesn't mean that it necessarily is going to benefit the community. There's a very interesting book that I'm going to be using in a class that I'll be teaching on international education research methods. And the book is called Decolonizing Methodology. It's written by, I can't remember her first name, but her last name is Smith. And in this book, it talks not about governance really, but it talks about research, shockingly, research methodologies, and how they have been dominated by imperial or more dominant groups, especially when the research subjects or those that are being researched are indigenous peoples and groups. And this would be akin to an indigenous people or group saying, no, we would rather not be researched by you guys from the West or from this Western-oriented organization. We would rather think about what our life means for ourselves. And there are ways that Smith points that out in her book. And then finally, if we look at national education policymaking, Leuze et al. Say that empirical studies indicate that international organizations primarily result in changes of national education policies and politics due to the specific nature of strategies applied, as well as due to the special role of education for national identities. So we've got nature of strategies applied, and then we've got the special role of education for national identities. And it's the combination of these two dimensions that encompass what we define as education policymaking, which are missing down here. It says, on the national level. So by combining specific strategies with the special role of education, you get education policy on the national level. Now, the impact that they're saying the international organizations have is that they change the kinds of strategies that are applied, and they change or they influence the way that education's special role is nationally identified or contextualized or influenced. This again is the internationalized, that "ized" part is important, education policy, because it's education policy and politics that relies on the international organization governance instruments. And essentially, they argue that the national capacity to resist or to change these international organization governance things, it's largely by saying no. It's largely through resistance. It's not an active, we're going to change it ourselves. And by the way, they're not saying that this just happened overnight. This is a long process of transfer from governance being located in national systems of education or national political systems even to international organizations. That's a long march to get to the point where they're saying what they're saying here, right? So don't think that they've come across this lightly. Okay. And then finally, they have a theoretical model for explaining changing education policy making, where they point out these are all the different governance instruments that we just went through. These are the veto power and the national viewpoints, which I know you can't see that down there, but that's what it says. And they talk about how there's convergence and divergence that happens from the national transformation as well as from the international organizations. Here's what I'm going to suggest. Really what they should be doing instead of this, really it's I think, would be better to run it all the way through or to run it straight into this. Right? Because it's this veto power, veto, and it's the national contextualization, really, I think more than anything else, that influences these governance instruments, the ability of international organizations to influence national education policy making. And then, of course, what comes out of national education policy making are actual policies and the politics themselves. Right? So there's some background on what Leuze and company call the two-level game. There is the sort of a more detailed explanation for their model of how international organizations use specific governance instruments in order to influence the decisions that are made about education and the policies and politics that are accompanying in national education. In quite frankly, I think they would argue that this happens everywhere in the world, but that there would be some variation, of course, due to particular context, regime type, development level, all sorts of things you can think of that would be related to national context.